a sudden, the front part of the upper level came down in a guillotine-type fashion.
We've got a possibly serious situation going on right now.
This is reported to be some kind of a collapse of a building or something of the sort at the Hyatt Regency.
Better get a bunch of ambulances down there. We got to report a bunch of people injured. Thank you. All right.
July 17, 1981, Kansas City, Missouri. The night the skywalks fell at the Hyatt Regency Hotel, causing the worst structural disaster in the history of the United States. Hello, I'm Joe Whitty, and welcome to Disaster Chronicles. In this program, we'll take you back to that summer evening to review the tragedy, and we'll look at its causes and what was learned. And we'll meet some of the survivors and some of the heroes of the rescue. The 40-story Hyatt was part of the Crown Center development to revitalize downtown Kansas City and had been open for only a year. It featured one of the trademarks of many Hyatt hotels, an open atrium. 3 skywalks dominated the area. On Friday afternoons, many gathered for tea dances, featuring music of the big band era. On this day, Gene and Tom Weir were looking forward to a festive occasion.
The evening was planned as a very social evening. We met relatives and friends at the Hyatt Regency to attend the tea dance. We listened to the music, had a couple drinks, danced a little bit, turned to walk up the hotel lobby, and the next impression or the next feeling I had was just of an incredible crashing feeling and then being pinned underneath the rubble.
I remember walking back towards our group of friends and this extreme pressure on my back, and the next thing I remember is being trapped in a very uncomfortable position. I couldn't see anything. All we could hear were moans and groans and screams and yelling.
An estimated crowd of 1,500 to 2,000 were there that evening. Just after 7 p.m., the band was playing Satin Doll when 2 of the skywalks collapsed and fell like a deck of cards. Hundreds of people were trapped under tons of tangled steel and concrete. What started out as a pleasant occasion turned into bedlam.
I looked up, and across there was people up on top. There was people in the coffee shop. There must have been 1,000 people. The music was playing. The bar was full, where they go up and get a drink, and all the way around it, it was full. So all of a sudden, it started to collapse.
It was like slow motion. This balcony was caving in, and they were caught, and they were just crushed, and it was like an earthquake. I've never been in an earthquake, but I think that's what an earthquake would be like.
Within minutes, the first of the police and fire rescue teams were on hand. It wasn't long before more than 40 rescue vehicles had arrived. Hundreds of police, firemen, and paramedics began sifting through the debris, looking for survivors. Rescue workers brought chainsaws and jackhammers. They couldn't use their blowtorches at first because they feared gas leaks. Bodies were strewn everywhere. Water from pipes broken by the collapse flooded the lobby floor. Many of the survivors, still dazed, joined in the rescue efforts. They told a frightening story.
We were standing right under the thing that fell, watching the dance contest, and the only thing I remember is we were standing there and there was something that just fell, and we were crushed underneath it, and there was about that much space. We got out.
As the thing came down, began to hit, everybody looked up, and then it just began to move down and shove down and bent. Some people were bent right double under it. Most of us were laid out, and as I say, the thing bent somewhat in I would say a V shape from where I could see it. We were under the right part of the V.
An area just outside the hotel was set up for the injured. Scores were laid out on the ground. Friends and volunteers and even bystanders tried to comfort the injured. Within minutes, the first of the bloody survivors had been loaded into what was to become a parade of ambulances to area hospitals. A helicopter evacuated the most seriously injured. Paramedics gave a grim picture of the scene inside.
What kind of condition are those bodies in as they're turned up?
Some of them aren't bad, some of them are beyond recognition even looking, you know, it's just heads cut off, arms cut off, cut in half, crushed, you name it, it's in there. Anything you can imagine could happen, it's happened.
Those people are where in the rubble?
Underneath, I guess, the balcony that collapsed. A lot of them came down. They got most of them out, I guess. There's probably a few in there left.
Would you expect death was instantaneous for these people?
Most of them, sure.
While the injured were being rushed to area hospitals, work continued into the night, looking for those people still trapped. Heavy equipment, including 2 cranes, arrived. They poked through the windows to lift the heaviest of the beams. And inside, a bulldozer and forklift also tried to pry through the debris. Every once in a while, there was a note of optimism.
The latest information, we have a little bit of good news for a change. Within the past 10 minutes, there have been 3 parties that have been brought out of the damaged area. They are alive. They're currently, they have transported 1 just a moment ago. The other 2 are being prepared to be transported to area hospitals.
But others were not so lucky. Throughout the night, workers kept digging, trying to move the huge girders which still trapped a number of men, women, and children. At 4:30 a.m., the last survivor was pulled out. For those trapped, it was a harrowing experience.
There was about 10 or 12 of us in the general vicinity. They were all alive and hollering and talking to each other. And
was your son close to you? Were you?
Yes,
did you touch your son?
Yes, we were pinned on top, or right beside each other. So we held hands and reassured each other.
What were your thoughts at that time?
Well, it's weird. After I realized probably what had happened, and I was still alive and I was still thinking and had some notion about what my injuries were. And I thought, well, depending on how long it takes me to rescue us, I think we're going to live.
It wasn't until 7:45 the next morning that the last band was removed to reveal a grim discovery: 31 more bodies. That was in addition to 80 bodies found during the night. Daylight had revealed the extent of the damage to the hotel. The once distinctive atrium was in ruins. Now that the rescue work had been completed, the cleanup could begin. 100 people had been critically injured. For some of the survivors, Saturday was a day for reflection and thanks. John Davis was coping with his injury and the loss of his wife.
We were just idle chit-chat there, standing, and all of a sudden everything fell. And my wife and 2 friends were underneath the balcony, and we lost them all 3. I'm very fortunate to be alive. At least there's somebody for my kids.
Ed Bailey and a friend were pinned under the debris.
I've severely fractured my left shoulder, and both of my ankles, and both legs are fractured, and broke my right hip. So I was really fortunate, though. I guess we all were who survived. Just very fortunate and very thankful.
Frida Johnson was in intensive care. Her husband was also hospitalized.
I could see people on either side of me weren't going to make it. And I don't know, it's one of those things that I made it. Not sure why.
That weekend, people from all over the Kansas City area came to donate blood.
My husband and I decided we had to do something to help you, so we decided to come down here and give blood because that was the only thing left we could do.
I've got kind of rare blood, so I thought, well, I'll come over here and probably somebody might need it.
Kansas City was a city in mourning. For days, families and friends attended funerals throughout the area.
We'll pray for all of them who have suffered tragedy this weekend. We pray for each other.
The big question was why? How could this have happened? The answer wouldn't come for months. The final death toll was 113. 189 were injured. Most of those were on the floor level beneath the second and fourth floor walkways or on the second floor walkway itself. Federal investigators were called in to determine the cause. That part of the story when we return.
We did have at that time, and we continue to have, a weakness in our system of design and construction in the United States.
Disaster Chronicles continues in a moment on A&E. Kansas City was clearly in shock the next day. Donald Hall, president of Hallmark Cards, the parent company which owned the building, called Friday the darkest night of my life. Concerned officials of the Hyatt Corporation, which managed the hotel, rushed to Kansas City. And the city council met to review the disaster. Meanwhile, the remainder of the guests checked out of the hotel that morning, and it was closed indefinitely. Sightseers lined the streets near the hotel as the cleanup began. As workers surveyed the damage in the next few days, they believed the third walkway, the one that had not fallen, was on the verge of collapse. On Thursday, it was taken down.
It appeared to be very similar to that design trouble which caused the drop of the catwalk on the fourth level to the second level and permitted both of these structures to plummet to the lobby floor below.
So the third skywalk was loaded onto a truck and taken to a nearby warehouse where it and the other beams were reassembled and studied for months to come. The National Bureau of Standards was called in from Washington to investigate. Edward Frang is now executive director of the American Society of Civil Engineers. At the time, he headed the inquiry, which included inspections of the wreckage and extensive laboratory tests and simulations.
There was a fundamental flaw in the connection between the rods that supported the various floors and the box beams which supported the actual walkways.
This is how the hotel lobby looked before the accident. The skywalk on the third floor hung by one set of rods, and the walks on the second and fourth floors held by a different set of rods. It was these walks which collapsed when the rods tore loose at the connections on the upper walk. The Bureau reassembled the undamaged portions of the beams in a laboratory for testing. Two C-beams, welded together into box beams, held up the upper walkway by rods hung from the ceiling and connected by nuts. A different set of rods and nuts extended down to hold up the lower walkway. The original design had called for a single rod to hold up both skywalks. This would have distributed the weight more evenly. But during construction, this design was changed to the double rod system, thus weakening the ultimate capacity of the walkways by putting the full load of both walkways on a single nut at each joint. It is these nuts which, under laboratory simulation, when similar weight was applied, tore through the beam and caused the accident. In addition, the original box beam hanger rod connection was weaker than required and would not have satisfied the Kansas City Building Code.
Well, it is quite questionable how that flawed plan ever got to the point where it went from the designer's drawing board out to construction without being picked up. The only explanation that I've been able to ascertain for that is that on the one hand, the designer felt that the fabricator was going to be picking up and considering the detailing or the finalizing of this connection detail, whereas the fabricator was assuming that the designer had already done that. So there was an assumption here on two parts that the other party was going to take responsibility for this, and it turned out that neither party actually had taken that responsibility upon themselves.
Frank said in the end, it was the system that was to blame. Even though there have been improvements, it is not always certain who has the ultimate responsibility in design and construction. Better communication is the key. To this day, the legacy of the Hyatt disaster continues.
I guess the thing that sticks in my mind is 113 people lost their lives, and I think we owe it to those people to do everything that's possible to make sure that their lives were not totally lost in vain.
Suits and countersuits were filed, 190 in all in federal and state courts, seeking $2.8 billion in claims. Eventually, settlements totaled $114 million. As part of a federal class action suit, Hallmark and Crown Center paid more than $7.6 million to area charities. Of the total suits, only 5 came to trial. And in 1986, the Missouri Board of Architects, Professional Engineers, and Land Surveyors revoked the engineering certificates of the 2 structural engineers on the project. In a moment, we'll see the importance of a disaster plan in rescue operations. Disaster Chronicles continues on A&E. The Skywalk collapse was the biggest test of emergency medical services in the Kansas City area. And by all accounts, the disaster plan and rescue operation were successful. The initial response of ambulances was very fast, thanks to a centralized dispatch system. And since the collapse occurred in an urban area, transportation time to hospitals was relatively short. A thorough review later indicated the importance of establishing command on the scene, including the identification of key personnel and better communications. There were a number of heroes in Kansas City that July, including Dr. Joseph Wackerly, the physician in charge, and Kansas City fireman Mike Trader on the left and Captain Ron Olds on the right. At one point, Olds volunteered to crawl beneath one of the beams which had been precariously lifted by a machine which was too small for the job.
You can't order somebody into something like that unless you do it yourself.
Did you ever stop and pause and think, maybe I ought not to do this? This thing could come down.
There's always that thought. But it had to be done. There were people alive under there.
After finding a number of dead victims, Olds heard some life coming from beneath a collapsed beam.
We had lifted it and worked for several hours and had almost completed lifting the east side of the top layer. And we took another bite, lifted it up, blocked it. I crawled in and removed a body. And then this little girl, she was probably 4 or 5 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes, she crawled out on her own. That was great.
Mike Trader found another trapped victim alive, a young boy about the age of his own son.
I just had to lay on the floor down there and try to talk to him through the concrete to reassure him. At that point, that seemed to be the best thing to do, and after a certain length of time, I got emotionally involved with him, wrapped up in the scene, stayed there for a few hours talking to him, trying to reassure him, try to pass on instructions from Dr. Joe and the men working above.
Dr. Joe Wackerly was in charge of triage that evening.
The Kansas City Hyatt had a number of heroes. Everybody did their job to the best of their ability, and if you had to single out a few, I would say it would be the victims and the lay people, because they weren't trained to do what we were trained and expected to do. We did our jobs. They delivered care and comforted their fellow victims in a really efficient manner throughout the whole ordeal. And those people, in my mind, were the real heroes. It proved to me that the people, at least in the community where I live, Kansas City, can care and help other people when the chips are down, when they really have to.
Less than 3 months after the accident, the Hyatt Regency reopened. Gone were the skywalk that had dominated the atrium in the original construction. Concrete pillars now supported the lone walkway. Many of the people in the lobby were friends of those who had been there in July.
You can't live with one tragedy forever, be it here or anywhere else for that matter.
I feel like it has been inspected and I was satisfied or I wouldn't have come.
I'm not afraid of it, or I wouldn't be here.
Most of the employees of the Hyatt did come back.
I thought it'd be strange, but when we came back in and everything was so different, it's kind of like coming to a whole new job.
The owner of the Hyatt Regency, Hallmark Cards, said the new design of the lobby area was supposed to be strong, and more importantly, look strong. Nevertheless, the memories remain. There were many lessons to be learned from the Kansas City disaster. For the construction industry, the need for better communication and a clear definition of responsibility. For emergency medical systems, the importance of a coordinated disaster plan. For the survivors and families of the victims, an awareness of the unpredictability and preciousness of life. More than a decade later, the nightmare of July 17, 1981 has not been forgotten, nor for some has the pain, both physical and emotional. That's Disaster Chronicles. I'm Joe Whitty.
Now stay tuned for In Search Of, next on A&E.